Prinny Anderson is the owner of Design for Learning and Change in USA. It is a partner with our company, Capital Plus Exchange. Prinny has been working with us and with our member institutions since 2006. She is a human resources and human capital expert and has conducted training and advisory services for microfinance institutions as well as commercial banks across Asia and Africa. She is the author of the Performance Management Handbook, which will be published in February 2013, and the Strategic Human Capital Management Toolkits for Executive Boards and Human Resources Teams, also to be published next year. She has years of field experience interacting with banking institutions in several emerging economies around the world. She's conducted quite a bit of secondary research with organizations in more developed economies, and she has recently completed a field study on banking institutions in Kenya.
Thanks, Liz, and welcome to everyone that's joined us today. There's one other point about the facilities of this webinar and online service that I wanted to mention, which is we're going to cover a lot of material today, and I hope that I address some of the questions that you might have, but I would be surprised to find that there won't be additional questions, things you thought of that do not get included in today's webinar. We will all have access to one another as peers for further discussion and to address additional questions via the portal. So please look for materials there and post questions and make comments, and let's continue the conversation about employee engagement. Today, what we're going to focus on, and what I hope you'll take away, is a sense of the specific SME banking, small business banking challenges related to engagement, because there's some unique aspects in that niche that you'll get a better sense, or confirm the sense you already have, of how performance, business performance, employee engagement, and the human capital management system are very tightly interlinked and need to be working together for best performance in all parts of that system. We'll review some ideas for assessing engagement and then for addressing gaps that might arise as a result of that assessment. And so our agenda is going to be defining engagement and looking at why it matters, going through the drivers of engagement, the challenges for SME banks, how the human capital management system contributes, so not just that it does, but how does that happen, and then again the assessment and gaps. And I wanted to supplement one thing that Liz said. The material we're covering today has come out of a lot of study. The study started with the question, does managing people well make any difference to business performance? And if it does, how does that happen? What would be the causes? And the research from organizations around the world came back to say, oh yes, managing people effectively, deploying people effectively does make a difference to business results, and we'll look at some of those findings shortly. And the driver, the big factor that makes a difference is employee engagement. So that's what led us to a lot of research and writing and training, and then also to doing this webinar with you. Employee engagement then is defined as a combination of these factors where we see commitment from employees to productivity, quality, and the success of the institution, and in fact that employees look out for the institution's interests. They look at beyond themselves. They're interested in improving the work processes, at being innovative and creative, and to do that as well as to look for performance success, they're more likely to give of their discretionary effort and time. They're not just clocking in at the last minute and clocking out at the first minute. They're loyal and more likely to stay with the institution, and they speak well of it to their outside associates. So those are major points that make up engagement. And then how do we know when engagement in a business of any kind is strong? Well, from stories and experiences that I've had, I've gathered some little indicative snapshots. So in one case, the functional staff in head office had flexible work hours, and one of the indicators of their engagement was that they were very diligent about keeping their schedules and about communicating with their team members. So although they weren't in the office, no one felt disconnected. Another story I was told in a different institution was about several instances where colleagues had needed to be away because of an illness or a family emergency, and their fellow loan officers, without a great deal of fuss and bother, had picked up on their loan monitoring visits and made sure that work continued vis-a-vis the client. We see experienced staff helping and teaching newer staff rather than taking advantage of the newer staff's naivete. In one case, I heard a story about the facility staff, the sweepers and cleaners and maintenance people, the carpenters, had gotten into the habit of proposing more cost-effective and more efficient approaches to their work in order to reduce waste and take advantage of recycling opportunities for the bank. Another thing that we see when employee engagement is strong is that performance reviews, the parts that the employees themselves prepare, are on target. Employees feel comfortable to be realistic about what they've done well and where they've had gaps, and their managers are fully involved in conducting the performance appraisal process. And then finally, another vignette that I've experienced is where, in a culture of strong engagement, the supervisors regularly bring up the institution's mission and its values when they have conversations with their teams about how to solve customer problems. On the other hand, when engagement is weak or missing, here are some things that we all notice, and the most frequently cited one is that turnover goes up. And it goes up in a particularly bad way, and I suspect all of us have seen instances of this. The more highly skilled and confident employees are the first to leave, the first to go look for better opportunities, and interestingly, and we'll circle back to this particular point later on, interestingly, those most desirable employees have been known to go to positions even with a slightly lower pay packet in order to get out of a low engagement environment and get into a high one. Other impacts that I've seen, or probably you've seen as well, is things like loan submission and loan review deadlines are often missed. Another issue that comes up regularly, probably because it's dramatic and a real problem, is that when turnover is bad, fraud is likely to go up. Grievances go up as well. Employees complain, they're frustrated, they're unhappy. As customers, we know about the one way we can tell if engagement is high or low in an organization is when the people we interact with as customers are disengaged with us and unfriendly, so cashiers or tellers look grumpy and don't respond very well. When we see staff taking an above average number of medical leave days, that's something to be looked at for engagement. And I heard one story about division heads who just weren't very committed to coming in for their job and not very concerned about the impact on their teams as a sign of poor levels of engagement. I mentioned earlier that we did research to find out whether managing people well, managing human capital effectively, makes a difference on performance. And here's a summary of some of the findings that we came up with. Higher return on total capital, a huge improvement in return on assets, nice improvements on return on equity and net profit, and interestingly enough, right in the middle of that table on the left side, you'll see that spending on human capital management actually tends to go down as institutions get better at it and give it more and more attention. And attracting and retaining good employees goes up, which is very important because turnover is a huge symptom of low engagement. And there's even an increase in organizations' market values. So investors, funders, and other stakeholders outside the institution become aware of the impact of effective human capital management and therefore value the institution more highly. And then we want to look at the other side of the coin because it tells a slightly scary story. When the human capital management system is weak, when managers are not very skillful at managing people, the likelihood of employees feeling disengaged goes up 300%. And the level of employee frustration is a third higher. But there's only a 12% increase in the possibility that employees will quit. So the more disengaged the culture is, the more people are frustrated, unhappy, unproductive, uncreative, complaining, filing grievances, being absent, but they don't leave, they stay. Sounds pretty awful. So between the benefits of effective human capital management, which generates engagement, and the negatives of having poor human capital management and low engagement, to my mind, there's a pretty compelling argument for addressing engagement and focusing on the fact that it matters. Now, how exactly might that be happening? And here's a map that I've drawn to put the pieces together and say that when employees are motivated and engaged, so they're committed to quality and productivity and success, the quality of performance is good and goes up, so we're working efficiently, productively, cost-effectively. We're more likely then to be bringing in an amount of revenue that's greater than the cost of operations and overhead, which is the definition of profit. With profit, we are able to make returns to our investors, and the combination of profitability and making returns is at least what our investors and our boards and our CFOs are likely to consider good business performance. So I understand this is a fairly simple map, but it does put the pieces together. So Liz, this is a point where I'm going to pause. We've said something about what engagement is, what we might see when it's strong or weak, and why it matters, and I'm wondering if any questions have come in.
Prinny, we're wondering if you have seen in your field experience different levels of engagement in businesses in different parts of the world. I know this may be a sensitive question, but are there any differences that comes out in the literature in your field experience?
That's an interesting question, and actually in a recent webinar that I attended, done by Connexa, they're a worldwide HR consulting firm, and they've recently done a worldwide study of employee engagement. And one of the big differences that they found was in some of the most thriving developing economies in Asia, employee engagement is actually lower than in steady state economies. And interestingly, even in, for example, Europe, where the economies have at the very least been very volatile and anxious making, and they hypothesize that management may have a belief that as long as the economy is booming and the business is growing and pay packets are good and employment is secure, they don't need to worry about engagement. And of course they're also very focused on growing and business success, so they may not be thinking about engagement either. So that was an outstanding statistic. Interestingly also, employee engagement is not correlated to how developed the economy is. So employee engagement can be, in their statistics show is as high in some of the developing economies as it is in some of the more developed economies. And as I said, a bit wobbly in engagement is a bit wobbly in some of the European countries because of the volatility, the economic volatility there, or at least they make that relationship. That's the correlation they make.
That's a really important point. I think you hit on the very last one, and it ties into another question we just received from India, which is, does the state of the economy impact engagement?
It doesn't have to. My own field experiences with institutions in India suggest that if I just take India, socially, politically, economically, I've seen the whole continuum of employee engagement from institutions that are getting awarded, that are being acknowledged as great places to work, to institutions that clearly are struggling to create any kind of employee engagement or are not paying attention to employee engagement. So it doesn't have to be tied to the economy. An exception that I would make to that from my empirical experience, in one country I was visiting a bank that talked about, this is an African country, that talked about the trouble they were having with turnover, that in the middle to more junior ranks, people were, it was like a revolving door. And as we discussed it further, someone said, well, what's happening here is that the employment market, the job market is so bad that we have instances of employees who are the sole support, the sole breadwinner for families of 10, 20, and sometimes as many as 30 people. And so when they see a chance to make even a little bit more money, they go to it because their survival and their family's survival is at risk. So in an economy where employees are literally at that level of survival risk, yes, your engagement is going to correlate to the economic situation and to the job market. Right now I'd like to go on to what the drivers of engagement are and what that means for managers and for HR teams. What drives employee engagement? These 8 factors are drawn from a very large number of studies, and I think we'll just go through each one of them to make sure that we have a little more than just the 2 words. So the first one is leadership behavior, role modeling, and ethics being very, very important. People want to feel that their leaders have integrity, and that is engaging, and lack of it is disengaging. And then a sense of the leader creating a sense of connection with everyone, that favoritism is very much downplayed or non-existent. Second driver are manager competencies. people management being right at the top of those competencies, that managers give clear work objectives and, to the extent possible, stimulating tasks and assignments. We know there's lots of routine work to be done, but to the extent that managers can create some stimulating assignments for all employees, the better at creating engagement, and that they are fair about how they allocate peak work. The third driver is the culture and the climate, one that where employees are helped to feel that they are aligned with institutional values. In Dubai in February, someone asked, what do you do if you do not feel aligned with institutional values? And there was a collectively large sigh in the room, as we all acknowledge that's a really big and philosophical question, which to my mind simply reinforces the importance of alignment with values. Employees feel part of the mission. Employees, especially our Gen X, our younger employees, need to feel part of something bigger than themselves. The workplace being collegial and flexible, and so the collegial part is what some of you identified as a fun place to work. It's nice to be here. I enjoy myself. I feel connected to the people I work with. And then that employees are empowered to carry out their jobs. And I think the reverse of that would be to say managers do their best to not micromanage. Again, I think you're seeing this as very critical to your Gen X employees, your younger employees, that they want to be the boss of themselves, as it were. Fourth driver is a sense that there's a future for me in the institution. There's career development and assignments that promote my future. And for a lot of institutions, there's a challenge here, which is that, to say this in very simplistic terms, not everybody here is going to become CEO. In fact, not everybody here is necessarily going to be able to rise to the next level. So exercising some creativity and putting in some effort to help employees feel that there are future options, including I've been in conversation with some banks in India that are looking at the possibility of outplacement for employees who are good, who are going to rise up, and who need to find a future opportunity somewhere else, and to have that managed by their employer as opposed to managed by the bank. Communication, and I cannot think of any relationship in which we would not agree communication is unimportant. So same thing with our employees. Transparency, we know what's happening, we know why. Information is shared widely across all levels and person to person, and the contrary side of that is in an institution where communication is not happening effectively and not happening widely, we know that there's plenty of communication, but it's people making stuff up, and when people make stuff up, it tends to be negative stuff. So sharing the right stuff is preferable to them making up the negative stuff. Sixth factor here is accountability and recognition. People want to see that others are held accountable, and that's for performance as well as for following the policies. They want to see that good performance is recognized, and that accountability does not depend on who you are or what job you have, that it's widely applied in the situation, trying to hold someone accountable, and they squirm and they squeak and they squawk and they carry on and they look like they are not interested in being held accountable at all. So I just would say, in spite of those individual experiences, what lots of both empirical data and research data shows is, even though they object individually, as a group they do want accountability. Training and development, I hope that that's almost obvious as to why that matters. People want to be able to do the current job well. They want to be prepared for a future job. So this ties in very heavily with career options, and it also ties in with a sense of having a connection to managers and somebody cares about me here. And then finally, what I learned about the role of incentives and compensation in regard to engagement is it's not how much, it's whether it's fair. So is everybody in a similar role being paid a similar amount? Is everybody performing to a similar level, getting similar kinds of incentives? And is there fairness vis-a-vis the job market? Do I understand the relationship of what I'm being paid or given as incentives to what the rest of the job market is receiving, what my friends and peers outside are receiving? So to generate these drivers, use these drivers to create engagement, we've said it's everybody's responsibility, and when you look at those factors, you see it's reinforced that leaders and managers have a critical role to play. The other point that I'd like to make about driving employee engagement is that it's an approach, it's a strategy, it's a philosophy, it's not an HR, quote, engagement program, unquote, because it's all encompassing. And the difficulties that I suspect my HR colleagues can relate to when engagement is seen as only an HR program is that there aren't enough highly placed champions, that implementation is really hard because the whole institution is not cooperating, is not rallied around this, and that it's harder to make the direct links to business. So we need managers, leaders, and HR professionals all together to drive engagement. And I think you've seen from the drivers that they speak to the need for leadership commitment and competency, for managers' commitment and competency, as well as for the role of HR as a partner and a supporter. So our next topic here is, what are some of the specific engagement challenges for small and medium enterprise banks or departments of larger banks? And to set the context for that, and to acknowledge, again, who's in our audience, I know that we're a combination of people, some from commercial banks who've expanded into the small business banking sector, some from microfinance institutions that are growing, expanding, moving out into small business banking, and then we may have people with us from non-bank financial companies that provide various financial services to small business. So part of what poses challenges, unique challenges for SME banking, is that it has unique lending practices around qualifying borrowers, handling applications, and other operations. There is a sector-specific borrower profile. How experienced are they? How big is their business? What do they expect, and what can a bank expect of them? And a unique business model in terms of the extent to which the bank interacts with the borrowers and monitors the performance not only of their loan but of their business. And in doing a comparison against some of those factors between an MFI that's moved into the SME space and a retail or commercial bank that's moving into it, we see that for the MFIs, the loan size may go up. For the commercial bank, the loan size is smaller. I'm not going to go through all of these in detail because our PowerPoints will be posted and you can capture the details for yourself by looking at the file. But just as to pick up on a couple of things, the loan application process may be more formal and complicated than was used in the MFI sector, and perhaps less formal and less complex than used in the commercial sector. Monitoring may have to be less intensive than for MFI customers, but more involved or more frequent than for commercial bank customers. So the SME banking world, in a sense, lives between these two. And of course, that means that we have some sector-specific requirements for the people that work for the SME banking of the business. They're not just cookie cutters of the people that worked either in the commercial bank or the MFI. So they need to be able to sustain a productive business relationship with a customer. They need to be able to adjust their mindset to the size of the loan and the type of business and the kind of business education that may or may not be needed. And so there are specific challenges in engaging this new kind of employee or a employee whose mindset and skill set needs to change. And the challenges are across all these different points, and we're going to look at some of them in a little more detail. So as a bank grows, an MFI that grows into SME banking may find that a sense of connection gets lost. In a commercial bank, if the SME banking department is out of the mainstream, it's not the central focus of the bank's business, there's a risk again of those employees not feeling connected, of leadership not making enough effort to connect specifically with that group of employees and the work that they're doing. The sense of mission can become confused or less clearly articulated, whether SME banking is seen as more commercial than what the bank had been doing, or if the SME department is simply an extension of a non-mission driven bank. So there's the challenge to give employees a sense of mission. Collegiality can change, especially as the bank grows. Flexibility can diminish if a bank becomes more heavily structured as it migrates to SME banking. Communication can become harder and take a lot more focused effort when we have more layers of staff, or if the SME department again is not part of the mainstream. And I've actually seen this next one about culture, where the SME bankers were specialized, which was valuable to the sector they're serving, but caused them to be seen as other. They're different from us. They're not like the rest of us in the bank. And while there was strong engagement within the SME banking group, there was disengagement between those employees and the larger group of the mainstream bank. So that's something to watch out for. I've also seen banks that moved willy-nilly into SME banking, and the training curriculum did not keep up, was not planned ahead, so that the training specific to SME banking wasn't provided. Careers can be a challenge if SME banking is, again, out of the mainstream. Where do the SME bank employees or department employees go after a period of time in SME banking? There can be a loss of the personal touch, and compensation just needs to be managed carefully. Along with training, compensation needs to be thought through in advance to make sure that it's adjusted to match the requirements of the SME banking world, and but that it doesn't put the employees in the SME banking part of the business at odds with their peers. That fairness factor has to be accounted for, so that definitely takes some thought. So again, Liz, I'm going to pause because we've looked at drivers of engagement. We've talked about the need for human capital management strategic approach, big picture approach to working on engagement, and then had a quick look at engagement challenges specific to SME banking, and I wanted to see if any questions had come in.
There were a few questions from the audience on something that you talked about earlier, which was whose role is it to drive engagement? And you talked a little bit about, you know, the HR manager's role as well as the business line's role. And I know that we have a split on the webinar today, about half are from HR and half are from, you know, business line management positions. But what does either an HR manager or an SME manager do if they feel like they are driving engagement or interested in driving engagement, but the culture of the institution isn't necessarily in alignment with them? So what does a manager do if they feel a little bit stranded in their, you know, goals of engagement goals?
Oh, and you know, Liz, I think both of us have seen that happen. So I have a lot of empathy for anyone that might be caught in that position. And the very first thing that I would say and have said to people is, you can't do this by yourself. So it'll be a case of taking a longer term view and starting by building alliances, finding some other people. If you are a business manager, finding other business managers. If you're in HR, you also want to find some business managers who can see the benefits. So this is where using some of that information about the benefits that business experience when they increase the level of employee engagement, you can use that material to talk about what are the performance factors that we would like to see improved, and then how could employee engagement contribute to those. So taking the drivers of engagement, connecting one or two of them to the desired performance improvements that your colleagues would like to see, and in a sense it's like becoming a salesman, selling engagement by using, here are the benefits, and then here are the buttons we could push, the areas we could work in that would help us toward those beneficial outcomes. Building alliances, selling on performance outcomes, and as that alliance grows, using good change management practices to begin to propose specific changes. So it's a multi-step process and it takes time. So I'm going to go back and take a quick look as to how does the human capital management system contribute to engagement. And when I say human capital management system, again, I'm not talking just about HR. So I'm talking about effective leadership, skillful people management, the climate with those factors in it that are shown to be drivers of engagement, communication, and then you do see a number of components of what I call performance management, because things like setting goals and monitoring performance, HR can support that. Managers actually have to carry it out. Training, on the other hand, may be most heavily coordinated and provided by the HR or the training department. Managers need to contribute and make sure that their team members get to the right trainings. So a lot of components to the human capital management system. Now, taking that little map that we looked at before, I've elaborated it specifically with the human capital management system in mind. So this map is saying all those components of the human capital management system that you see on the left are what help us to have the right people doing the right work in the right way at the right time, headed in the right direction, so doing what the strategy of the bank is asking us to do. which all adds up to those employees being well motivated and engaged, and then also adds up to good quality employee performance and good quality business performance. So having all the pieces of the human capital management system in place and running well, and the managers collaborating with the HR department to make all that happen, can be seen to be a significant part of what leads to good performance. To sustain engagement, what do our different constituencies need to be doing? This is a very quick summary. Senior managers or executives have their part in developing their own competencies in relation to the engagement drivers and to leading the whole institution towards strengthening the engagement drivers. The big burden of creating engagement sits on the middle managers and the frontline supervisors, because each manager is the world of work for his or her team members. So the better they are at managing and relating and communicating with those people, the more engaging the experience is for those team members. And then finally, the HR system, our team, has this very critical role to play in creating the systems and the tools and activities that allow managers to get better and better at building engagement, and that do their own part in contributing to engagement. So it's a really quick summary, and I think our strategic human capital management toolkits that are coming out soon will build a lot more on all of this, assessing engagement and addressing the gaps. And there are a variety of approaches to assessing engagement, from simple informal methods that are maybe more conversational than documented, all the way up to using very sophisticated professional benchmarked audits. What we've got here, and this, I think you'll want to get this particular PowerPoint off the portal, because this is a list of sources for engagement assessments or organizations that provide audits. And how do you know what kind of assessment to be doing and which tools and resources might be appropriate? Well, to a certain extent, it's going to depend on how mature the institution it is, or if we're just focused on the SME banking portion of the institution, how mature that line of business is. So pretty basic rule of thumb here is that the newer, smaller the institution, the simpler the process, and then as the institution matures, becomes more sophisticated, more established, it might use more established and sophisticated tools. This is not just a question of whether you have the money to spend. It's also a question of bandwidth of attention. How much brain space can we give? And then also, how stable are we? How much do we want to invest in studying engagement in a still very volatile and dynamic startup versus the more steady state institution? Both in my own experience and in the research, the most frequently occurring gaps in engagement are unsatisfactory compensation and incentives. And I want to point out that when that factor comes up, people will complain about their pay packet more readily than they will complain, at least publicly, about their boss. So grumbling about how much we're getting paid and we don't get good incentives, or we don't get any incentives, or it may be a symptom of some other level of disengagement, some other kind of disengagement. So I encourage institutions to treat, unless they're really paying very low salaries and incentives, I would suggest looking beyond that gap to see what else is going on. And of course what you get to very quickly is a pair of factors related to relationship between the employee and the manager, and then this unfairness, this kind of climate issue of people are treated unfairly, I'm treated unfairly, other people are favored, those kinds of things. And then the last factor is career potential, which in some cases I've heard it expressed actually with sadness, that people say there's no future for me here. I'm sad. I would like to stay here, but I need to grow. And that last factor, the career potential factor, is also really, really important for our younger employees, our Gen X. We know that some of them would like to be CEO next week, and we have to contain them a little bit and give them a more realistic view. But nonetheless, their desire for career potential is important, and we have to pay attention to it if we're going to keep them engaged. In terms of addressing gaps in engagement, there is not one answer that fits all solutions. So what I am offering here is a process, not an answer. So it's a process for getting your own answer. And again, this is where if there's any way in which we on the SBBN network can be helpful to folks who want to work their way through this process, we would be delighted to do that. So the process is to find out the gaps, figure out their impact, and this is where you connect gaps to performance, and then correlate the gap in the performance with one or more engagement factors. Look at what changes would be needed to address the engagement issues, prioritize them. I'm not going to do everything all at the same time, and think in terms of low-hanging fruit, something we could do right away that would build momentum and credibility around our attempts to address engagement problems, as well as investments, activities that are longer term, that are going to take a while before we can construct them and before we see the impact. And then finally, the planning and implementation of our priorities identified in the previous step. So to wrap up presenting and leave ourselves with a bit more time for questions, just want to say that we've gone through today what engagement is and why it matters, what impact it can have on performance, what drives engagement, and what does that mean, and given that those 8 drivers, what does that mean for managers and HR teams? What are some of the engagement challenges that an SME department or an SME bank might experience? How the human capital management system can contribute to creating engagement, what role it has to play, and then assessing engagement, and at least in a generic look at how to go about addressing gaps in engagement. And so I will stop presenting at this point, Liz, and see if we have questions.
We did have a few questions around a topic that was briefly touched upon, I'm not sure directly addressed. And Prinny, the question is really for people at different levels of the institution, especially middle managers as well. Are there goals or are there formal ways of gauging how employees are participating in their culture of engagement or engagement of the people that report to them? Do you have any suggestions on how to kind of measure or monitor in a little more formal way how people are doing this?
So if I'm understanding, there could be 2 questions in there. Mm-hmm. So I'm going to mention them both. One question could be, how could I, as a manager, assess whether the people that report to me, and if I have managers reporting to me, the whole team of my direct reports and their direct reports, so our function or our department or our division, how engaged is everybody, mm-hmm. So that I have a sense of what needs attention. And there's a second question, which is how well are my managers? So again, imagine if I'm a department head and I have 2 or 3 managers reporting to me, how well are they doing at creating engagement, fostering engagement, sustaining it in their teams? And one step that can be taken is, with the help of the HR team, to have an upward feedback survey done that perhaps covers both managers' people management practices and skills, as well as including questions about employees' sense of engagement. So how do the employees see their managers as doing? And then use the output of that upward feedback survey to have developmental conversations and coaching conversations with the managers involved, to really treat that kind of survey as a development activity, not a performance review activity, because it's hard for people to take in criticism when they feel that their job or their bonus or their pay is on the line. We also have a couple of tools that a manager could use as an informal employee engagement survey. So to the first part of the question, how can I find out how engaged my team feels, I think we're going to be posting an informal survey that anybody in the network could download and use to their heart's content and with our best wishes.
That's great, and I think that leads into this next question that I received from a partner in Bangladesh, asking, could you give some examples of low-hanging fruit for effective engagement initiatives?
One kind of low-hanging fruit, assuming that the top executive team is on board with giving attention to employee engagement, is to hold town hall meetings where executives, CEO, CFO, COO, get out and talk to, and well, I was going to say talk to people in the branches, people in the functions, but actually the most important part is not the executives talking, it's the executives listening while the employees talk. That doesn't cost doesn't cost very much, and it can be started promptly. Another kind of low-hanging fruit would certainly be to invite a cross-section panel of employees to make input to managers, leaders, and HR. Depends how easy it is to make adjustments, for example, in compensation or incentives. I know in some organizations that's a big process, and in other organizations it's not as difficult. But to look at whether there are any fairness issues that could be addressed and discussed, and upward feedback about managers accompanied by really focused coaching. So let's say first-line managers get upward feedback. Some of them are shown to be doing things that create disengagement, and their managers being able to start coaching them and asking them to show different behavior, new behavior, or discontinue non-productive behavior. that can also be done relatively quickly, and at least for the employees connected to those managers, there can be a pretty quick impact. So those are some things that occur to me off the top of my head, and I will continue to think about that question, and we'll put some other ideas onto the portal.
As Prinny mentioned, for those who are members, we will take all of the questions that have been submitted to us today and have continuing ongoing discussions on our web community for those. So we do encourage you to participate where you can, give examples from your institution, as well as ask other questions of our expert here with us today, Prinny. Thank you so much again for all of you who have participated today. As a reminder, we do offer a range of on-site strategic human capital management projects, including customized workshops and trainings, webinars, and other capacity building.